Hello and welcome to Owning the Narrative. I am Bulow. The show will feature the top news of the week, complete with my observations, and even a little bit of sarcasm thrown in. The top news stories will be taken from my morning news briefings that I write on the Rick Bulow New Media blog every weekday morning. If you go on to like what you see, smash that thumbs up button. And now, let's go right into the news. President Biden had his first press conference on Thursday, and I touched on a little bit of it on Friday, but there is more about it. This coming from my good friends over at the Washington Examiner. Biden skips over a major news outlet in first solo press conference of his presidency. Fox News reporter Peter Doocy and host Dana Perino expressed frustration for not being called on to ask a question during President Joe Biden's first solo press conference since taking office. I was not kidding, we had a lot, Ducey said, holding up a binder full of questions that he had planned to ask Biden, but he was not selected as one of the 10 speakers or reporters to speak. Ducey said two of his questions revolved around the Green New Deal and the origins of the coronavirus, which were subjects that were both skipped over in the press conference. We did not get on the board with that. Nobody else asked about that, Ducey said. Firmino said or added that she believes Ducey should have been allowed to ask a question, and took a shot at CNN White House correspondent Jim Acosta in the process. Peter Ducey is not Jim Acosta. Firmino, who served as former President George W. Bush's White House press secretary, said, "He's got good questions." Why make Peter Ducey a story, she wondered aloud. Just take his question and move on. Ducey is widely considered as a White House reporter who asks the toughest questions, and Biden has acknowledged as much. I know he always asks me tough questions and he always has an edge to them, but I like him anyway, Biden said about Ducey at a January event. Biden's first official press conference Thursday came on the 65th day of his presidency, which marks the first time in at least a century that a president has avoided the media event for that long. During the press conference, Biden said he plans to run for president again in 2024, suggested that the filibuster is racist, and responded to the current illegal immigration surge at the border by saying he should be flattered people are coming across because he's a nice guy. Now, I agree with Dana Perino. I mean, just don't rely on a list of people. I mean, just ask any and make sure everybody gets a chance at asking the questions at the press conference. I mean, after all, that's why there is a press conference. And there's this from the Washington Free Beacon on the press conference, just adding a little more to it. Biden bumbles his way through first White House press conference. President Joe Biden struggled during his first official press conference on Thursday, pausing frequently to check his notes on the podium and occasionally losing his train of thought, as if distracted by the voices echoing madly in his geriatric brain. The president appears somewhat lucid at times, but didn't always communicate in a comprehensive manner or fashion. This makes Jim Crow look like Jim Eagle, Biden said in response to a question about so-called voting rights legislation. On that topic, Biden cited Republican opposition to Democrat-approved bills as a reason for his willingness to consider eliminating the Senate filibuster to avoid complete lockdown and chaos in Congress. The best way to get something done, if you hold near and dear to you that you like to be able to, Biden clarified. Anyway, we're going to get a lot done. Regarding the immigration crisis on the southern border, Biden assured reporters that he would commit to transparency in the near future. How soon? As soon as I am in position to implement what we're doing right now, he explained. I don't know, he added. Biden also issued a thinly veiled threat against Vice President Kamala Harris, who has been tasked with leading the administration's response to the border crisis. It's going to get a whole hell of a lot better real quick, or we're going to hear some people leaving. He said of the situation at the border, we can get this done. Now, Michelle Sindor, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour, grilled Biden on whether the border crisis was being fueled by the perception of you that you got elected as a moral, decent man. Biden demurred. I guess I should be flattered, he said, but went on to suggest that most illegal immigrants are crossing the border for other reasons. Biden conspicuously declined to take a question from Fox News reporter Peter Doocy, with whom the president has sparred with in the past. On one occasion during the 2020 primary, Biden berated Doocy for asking about the love child his son, Hunter Biden, had fathered with a stripper. It's a private matter. I have no comment, Biden seized. Only you would ask that. You're a good man, classy. Months later, Biden lashed out at Doocy in response to a question about Hunter's shady business dealings in Ukraine. Asked the right question, Biden barked at Doocy after repeatedly jabbing his finger at the reporter. When pressed on his plans to run for re-election in 2024, the president bristled at the female reporter who asked the question. That is my expectation, Biden huffed at the Nobel journalist, who was just trying to do her job by reporting the truth. I don't know where you guys come from, man. He added that he would fully expect Harris to be his running mate, adding that the VP is doing a great job, well, for now anyway. And there's also this from the Federalist by Jordan Davidson. Biden relied on a pre-selected list of reporters during his first presser. After delaying hosting an official news conference for more than 9 weeks in office, President Joe Biden heavily relied on a pre-selected list of reporters to decide who he would call on for questions on Thursday. Incredible awkward moment as Joe Biden struggles to find which hand-picked reporter to call on next from the list. And it's a pre-selected list for Biden's questions. That a tweet from Jason Miller. Philip Melanchthon Wegman tweeted out, Biden appears to be calling on reporters from a prepared list. Now, while some presidents made a point to use a preferred press list in the past, Biden only fielded questions from 10 of the 25 reporters located in the White House's East Room, many of whom injected their own agendas, bias, and narratives into their leading questions about immigration, the filibuster, and foreign policy. One taxpayer-funded journalist at PBS asked if the influx of migrants at the U.S.-Mexico border is because Biden is so moral and decent. You've said over and over again that immigrants shouldn't come to this country right now, that this isn't the time to come. That message is not being received, Yamiche Sindor said. Instead, the perception of you that you got elected or that got you elected as a moral, decent man is the reason why a lot of immigrants are coming to this country and trusting you with unaccompanied minors. And another reporter asked Biden if former President Barack Obama suggesting that the filibuster is a relic of the Jim Crow era is accurate. A sentiment that he readily agreed is true. Even though multiple reporters were granted access to the indoor presser, certain White House correspondents, such as Fox News' Peter Doocy, who has a history of pressing White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki to answer his questions instead of giving him the runaround, were overlooked and never called on by the president. Daily Caller said, folks, I'm going, and with that, President Biden completes his press conference in which he answered questions from a list of 10 reporters of the 25 that were in the room. Just Ryan Saavedra tweeted out, just received word that Fox News reporter Peter Doocy was in the room and Joe Biden refused to call on him. While apparently Doocy was not on Biden's pre-approved list of reporters to call on, Matt Whitlock tweeted out, pretty glaring, to walk up to the podium with an approved list of media to call on and leave off the Fox News and Peter Doocy. Now, the president previously delayed formal official discussions with the press far longer than at least 15 of his most recent predecessors, such as former Presidents Donald Trump and Barack Obama. And of course, there's this from Politico on the press conference. Biden meets the press and the pandemic disappears. The president's first news conference on Thursday was notable for what wasn't asked. During the first news conference of his presidency, Joe Biden was never asked about the issue that likely got him elected and, in all likelihood, will be the defining crisis of his time in office. Over the course of 62 minutes on Thursday, the COVID-19 pandemic never arose, except for in the president's remarks at the start of the event, touting the accomplishments his administration has made in the U.S.'s year-long fight. The absence of the issue from the press conference illustrates the degree to which a host of other challenges had begun to dominate Biden's time in office: a surge of migrants crossing the southern border, back-to-back mass shootings, and efforts to restrict voting in Republican state houses. Some Democrats were incensed that COVID never came up, but others, including Ron Klain, the White House chief of staff, publicly pushed the notion that the lack of discussion was merely a reflection of Biden's discipline in handling the pandemic. The president and his team have set expectations low and routinely cleared them, all the while trying to create a deliberate contrast with the chaos that defined their 4 years of Donald Trump's presidency. When Biden emerged in the ornate East Room to address the media, he announced that he was doubling his vaccination goal from 100 million shots administered in 100 days to 200 million because of that early success. I know it's ambitious, twice our original goal, but no other country in the world has come close to what we're doing, he said. From there, the pandemic was not mentioned again. As he ventured onto other topics, Biden tried to maintain the discipline he brought to the pandemic. He called on 10 reporters seated apart, mostly from high-profile mainstream newspapers and networks, although conservative and liberal outlets were present, including Newsmax, Huffington Post, and Sinclair Broadcasting. They peppered him with question after question about the rush of migrants seeking refuge at the border, which has drawn criticism from Democrats complaining about the treatment of children in cramped shelters, and Republicans who blame him for rescinding Trump's policies, which they say caused the influx. I make no apologies for ending programs that did not exist before Trump became president, that had an incredibly negative impact on the law, international law, as well as on human dignity, Biden said. They asked about whether he would support changes to the filibuster that could pave the way for the Senate to allow undocumented immigrants to gain a legal path to citizenship, restrict firearms, and expand voting access across the nation. If we have to, if there is complete lockdown and chaos as a consequence of the filibuster, then we'll have to go beyond what I'm talking about, he replied. They asked about U.S. troops remaining in Afghanistan, to which Biden said that he can't picture having them there next year, but acknowledged that they will not all be out of the country by the May 1st deadline set by Trump. And in answer to two questions about his political future, the nation's oldest president said for the first time that he expects to run for re-election in 2024 with Kamala Harris on the ticket. The answer is yes. My plan is to run for re-election, Biden, 78 years old, said. That's my expectation. Now, during Trump's last year in office, the pandemic dominated his interactions with the media. Biden had argued at the time that Trump had forfeited his right to be president because he failed to take coronavirus seriously, mismanaging the response by not quickly dispatching tests, vaccines, and supplies across the country. But 2 months into office, after Biden had prevailed on his message that he'd handle the pandemic differently than Trump, he received no questions about it or his $1.9 trillion package to address it, or the goal to get all Americans vaccinated for it. Inside the room, which was limited to 30 seated reporters due to the coronavirus, Biden, clad in a dark suit, stood at a lectern, calling on reporters from lists in front of him. A self-proclaimed gap machine, he had no notable slip-ups and filled his answers with some of his trademark phrases, here's the deal, and God willing. Come on, he responded to a reporter when he was asked if he found it acceptable that migrant children were sleeping on floors in crowded shelters. He repeatedly used the word folks and responded to reporters as such before leaving the room. But he did stop his answers short at several junctures and notably flipped through notes as questions were being asked of him. I'm giving you too long an answer, he said at one point before saying maybe I'll stop there. Biden had waited more than 2 years to answer questions from reporters in a formal setting in a break from his most recent predecessors, who held one within a month. At this point, Trump had held one solo news conference and 4 alongside foreign leaders. Barack Obama held 2 and George W. Bush had participated in 3. Biden's answers were, at times, long-winded, a less professorial version of his former boss Obama, who famously took his time in responding to questions. It was certainly different from Trump, who was notoriously unscripted, calling on reporters who his staff had not selected and announcing policies that his staff had not vetted or even known about. In his first news conference, a 77-minute made-for-TV event, Trump attempted to deflect attention Russian interference in the election and questions about his ability to govern, criticizing the media's exchanges with the group that he dubbed the enemy of the people. By the time Biden had taken his last question, the critiques from fellow Democrats began pouring in over the lack of discussion about a pandemic that has claimed 540,000 lives to date. For Team Biden, it all felt quite familiar. It's the same persistent disconnect we saw between Twitter and newsrooms on the one hand and voters on the other, said a former Biden campaign aide. The questions were too often motivated by what personally entertains cable news panelists, like trying to predict the outcome of the 2024 GOP primary, when when superficiality crowds out the top issue to the American people. That's a real failure. And that's what I mean. You know, many people wanted to hear about the pandemic other and other things, so just ask the question about it, and also ask questions of all reporters, or and not just a few select favorites. But anyway, leave a comment below as to what you think about President Biden's first press conference. Did you watch it? How do you think he did? And I'll see you in the next video. Yesterday was the first day of the trial of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin, the officer who would kill George Floyd by kneeling on his neck and just remaining there for 8 minutes 45 seconds. There are a few highlights from it, so let's get right into it. This from the National Review, and it's entitled, Derek Chauvin's attorney opens trial claiming he used necessary force during George Floyd arrest. Attorneys representing former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin opened his murder trial Monday morning by arguing that their client used a necessary level of force while arresting George Floyd, and that Floyd's death was the result of a combination of factors outside Chauvin's control. Chauvin was filmed pinning African-American Minneapolis resident George Floyd to the ground during his arrest in May 2020. Floyd lost consciousness while Chauvin knelt on his neck and was pronounced dead soon after the incident. The death of Floyd sparked massive riots and protests against police brutality across the U.S. Attorney Jerry Blackwell, appointed to the prosecution by State Attorney General Keith Ellison, said that prosecutors would show that Chauvin killed Floyd through excessive use of force. You will learn that on May 25, 2020, that Mr. Derek Chauvin betrayed this badge when he used excessive and unreasonable force upon the body of Mr. George Floyd, Blackwell said. During the trial, the evidence is going to show that there was no cause in the first place to use lethal force against a man who was defenseless, who was handcuffed, who was not resisting, Blackwell said. However, Blackwell did add that the prosecution would not aim to attack police in general, and would only focus the attack, or it would focus only on the allegations against Chauvin. Now, Chauvin's attorney, Eric Nelson, followed with statements for the defense. Nelson said that the defense would show that Chauvin acted within reasonable bounds during his arrest of Floyd. You will learn that Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do over the course of his 19-year career, Nelson said. The use of force is not attractive, but it is a necessary component of policing. Nelson emphasized that his case would be built on evidence presented during the trial, without reference to political pressures outside the courtroom. There is no social or political cause in this courtroom, Nelson said. On May 25, 2020, officers arrived at a convenience store after an employee called police, saying Floyd used a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase cigarettes. The officers attempted to arrest Floyd and place him in the back of a squad car, but Floyd exited the car and fell to the ground, telling officers he had claustrophobia, according to the arrest affidavit. After Chauvin arrived at the scene, he pinned Floyd down by placing his knee on Chauvin's neck. Chauvin continued to press Floyd to the ground for over 8 minutes, with Floyd repeatedly saying he couldn't breathe. Floyd lost consciousness while pinned down, and medical workers who arrived by ambulance were unable to revive him. The incident was captured on video and sparked massive riots in Minneapolis, during which rioters burned down a number of businesses as well as the city's third police precinct, whose officers arrested Floyd. All officers involved in Floyd's arrest were fired from the department. Rioting spread to cities across the U.S., causing between $1 and $2 billion in damages. Floyd's death also sparked a wave of major protests against police brutality, including calls by activists to defund police departments entirely. However, the push to defund police has met with resistance in Minneapolis itself, where the city council voted in February to increase the police budget in order to attract new recruits to the force. Chauvin faces charges of second-degree intentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. After initial resistance, Hennepin County District Court Judge Peter Cahill agreed to allow the third-degree murder charge earlier this month. And that's that from National Review. And there's also this article from ABC Go. The video showing former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin pinning George Floyd to the ground for more than 9 minutes as Floyd begs for his life and onlookers scream for the officer to relent may appear damning, but is what Chauvin did criminal? And is that video enough to prove him guilty of the murder and manslaughter charges he faces when he goes to trial? Legal professionals who have followed the pretrial filings and maneuverings say that even with that stunning and difficult to watch visual evidence, the case against Chauvin is anything but a slam dunk. Now, while Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison is bringing the state's case against Chauvin before Judge Peter Cahill, the lead prosecutor in court is Assistant Attorney General Matthew Frank. Frank will face difficult challenges posed by the requirements of the law. For instance, in order for Chauvin to be guilty of the most serious charge, second-degree unintentional murder, prosecutors must first prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he caused Floyd's death, but autopsy reports will complicate that task. The county medical examiner's autopsy report found that the 46-year-old Floyd died of a combination of causes including cardiopulmonary arrest, complicating law enforcement subdual, restraint and neck compression, and that his system showed fentanyl intoxication, recent methamphetamine use. Although the report called the manner of death homicide, it's not clear how much weight that carries in court. The report states that this is not a legal determination of culpability or intent. Now, meanwhile, an independent autopsy ordered by Floyd's family also reported that he died by homicide, but said it was caused by asphyxiation due to neck and back compression that led to a lack of blood flow to the brain. Floyd family attorney Ben Crump also criticized the medical examiner's autopsy for including toxicology results, saying the cause of death was that he was starving for air, there was lack of oxygen, and so everything else is a red herring to try to throw us off. So there is likely to be a battle of the experts at the trial over what exactly caused Floyd's death, according to Minneapolis criminal defense attorney Mike Rant. Those testifying about the autopsies are going to be up on that stand for a long time, getting into heavy-duty scientific stuff about the different mechanisms of what was going on in George Floyd's body at the time the knee was on the neck. He said defense attorneys will raise questions like whether the lack of oxygen occurred because he had a cardiac incident, or was his death brought about from some combination of controlled substances. Such autopsy arguments suggest Brand who could muddy the picture of what exactly caused Floyd's death. University of Minnesota law professor Richard Pace agrees, stressing that on any element of the prosecution's case, the defense has to raise a reasonable doubt, or at least get one juror to say, I'm not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that they've proved causation here. But Fraze believes that even with these arguments over psychological mechanics, the prosecution has the edge because they can argue that Floyd wouldn't have died as soon as he did if the police hadn't been stressing him physically and emotionally, and as long as they accelerate his death, that's causation. Another challenging requirement of the second-degree murder charge is that prosecutors must prove Chauvin caused Floyd's death while committing or attempting to commit a felony offense. In this case, that offense is third-degree felony assault, defined as someone intentionally inflicting or attempting to inflict bodily harm. Now, did Chauvin commit an assault when he restrained George Floyd, or was he justifiably acting as a police officer is trained to do in such a situation? Here, Rand foresees a second battle of the experts, this time use of force specialists. He predicts those on the defense side will say that the restraint Chauvin used on Floyd was reasonable and even authorized by the Minneapolis Police Training Manual. Filed as an exhibit in the case, they will agree, Brand says, such restraint was warranted because these are unpredictable situations. His feet were still free, his head was still free, he could headbutt you, he could do any number of things, and it's dangerous, particularly somebody who has controlled substances in them. Joseph Daly, Professor Emeritus at Mitchell Hamline School of Law in Minneapolis, suggests that Chauvin will try to dodge the assault element by asking the court to look more closely at the video. Chauvin's going to say, I never knelt on his neck for 9 minutes. If you look carefully, you'll see my knee on his shoulder. Sometimes my knee is on his back. I'm not kneeling on his neck all the time. I had no intention of assaulting the guy. I had no desire to assault him. And I was using techniques that I was taught in the Minneapolis Police Department to use, said Daly. Fraze predicts expert witnesses for the prosecution will testify that Chauvin's use of force was unreasonable, and even if authorized, it went well beyond that same police manual. It apparently permits the restraint Chauvin used, but only when suspects are actively resisting. Fraze said that's key because Floyd is clearly unconscious and not resisting well before Chauvin finally removes his knee. Yet the officer kept up the force, notes Fraze, and the prosecution can say any use of force has to be necessary and no force, even non-deadly force, was necessary anymore when he passed out. Some legal observers believe that the lesser charge of second-degree manslaughter is going to be easier for the prosecution. It requires proof that Chauvin caused Floyd's death through, according to the statute, culpable in negligence, meaning that he created an unreasonable risk and consciously takes chances of causing death or great bodily harm. Brands believes that there is a lot more room for the prosecution under that charge. He notes that the length of time Chauvin spent with his knee on Floyd's neck or back makes it clear that he was creating an unreasonable risk or taking a chance of death or harm. He thinks prosecutors will say, come on, what else could happen by doing this? A recent development could mean that third-degree murder will be added to the charges against Chauvin. That's what he was initially charged with following Floyd's death, until Judge Cahill dismissed that charge in October. An appellate court ruling on Friday means Cahill must now reconsider allowing the charge. And even if he does reinstate the third-degree murder charge as prosecutors want, Frank's team will have to prove Chauvin caused Floyd's death by perpetuating an act eminently dangerous to others and evincing a depraved mind without regard for human life, according to the statute. The maximum penalties for all the charges are severe: 40 degrees for second-degree murder, 25 years for third-degree murder, and 10 years for the manslaughter charge. But these are also misleading and are another area where expectations may conflict with reality. Presiding Judge Cahill is required by Minnesota law to follow sentencing guidelines. Under these, a penalty for both second-degree unintentional murder and third-degree is about 10 to 15 years. For the manslaughter charge, the common sentence under the guideline is 4 years. While prosecutors have asked for an upward departure, allowing Cahill to impose a longer sentence, legal experts interviewed by ABC News all believe it very unlikely that he would hand it down anything close to that 40-year maximum for the most serious charge. Chauvin has pleaded not guilty. 3 weeks have been set aside for jury selection, but will finding impartial jurors be possible, particularly given how widely viewed the video was and the weeks of protests and violence that impacted Minneapolis after the incident? Face acknowledges that it's a difficult task, but not an impossible one, noting that potential jurors could be drawn from rural areas that really don't pay much attention to Minneapolis and may hold views that would balance those of its residents. The jurors will serve anonymously, but the verdict they render will be widely scrutinized. Daly says that this might be one of the most important cases ever in the United States. For those paying attention, he says it means re-examining the power of the police and the use of force and how police are trained. Are they guardians of the people? Are they warriors against the people? What is the function of the police? These are the sorts of questions that this trial may prompt many to consider both in the courtroom and across the country. Now, this is going to be interesting. I admit I did not watch yesterday or some of today's court proceedings. I don't know, and I highly doubt I will watch it. However, I will read about it because, from the news briefings and just take it from there. But yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see just what'll happen with all this. Now, yesterday there was a witness that described seeing Floyd slowly fade away. This coming from the Associated Press. Now, now, the link that's in the description section might be a little bit different from what I'm reading, so bear with me on that. Because it is the Associated Press and they do update it whenever new information is available, but this is what I had gotten earlier today. Witness describes seeing Floyd slowly fade away. A man who was among onlookers shouting at a Minneapolis police officer to get off George Floyd last May was to continue testifying Tuesday, a day after he described seeing Floyd struggle for air and his eyes welling back into his head, saying he saw Floyd slowly fade away like a fish in a bag. Donald Williams, a former wrestler who said he was trained in mixed martial arts including chokeholds, testified Monday that he thought Derek Chauvin used a shimmying motion several times to increase the pressure on Floyd. He said he yelled at the officer that he was cutting off Floyd's blood supply. Williams recalled that Floyd's voice grew thicker as his breathing became more labored, and he eventually stopped breathing. From there on, he was lifeless, Williams said. He didn't move, he didn't speak, he didn't have no life in him, no more on his body movements. Williams was among the first prosecution witnesses as trial opened for Chauvin, 45 years old, who was charged with murder and manslaughter in Floyd's death. Prosecutors led off their case by playing part of the bystander video that captured Floyd's arrest on May 25th. Chauvin and 3 other officers were fired soon after the video touched off outrage and protest, sometimes violent, that spread from Minneapolis around the world. Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell showed the jurors the footage at the earliest opportunity. During opening statements after telling them that the number to remember was 9 minutes 29 seconds, the amount of time Chauvin had Floyd pinned to the pavement last May, the white officer didn't let up even after a handcuffed Floyd said 27 times that he couldn't breathe, and when Blackwell said, he put his knee upon his neck and his back, grinding and crushing him until the very breath, no, ladies and gentlemen, until the very life was squeezed out of him, the prosecutor said. Chauvin attorney Eric Nelson countered by saying Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do over his 19-year career. Floyd was fighting efforts to put him in a squad car as a crowd of onlookers around Chauvin and his fellow officers grew and became increasingly hostile, Nelson said. The defense attorney also disputed that Chauvin was to blame for Floyd's death. Floyd, 46 years old, had none of the telltale signs of asphyxiation, and he had fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system, Nelson said. He said Floyd's drug use, combined with his heart disease, high blood pressure, and the adrenaline flowing through his body, caused a heart rhythm disturbance that killed him. There is no political or social cause in this courtroom, Nelson said, but the evidence is far greater than 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Blackwell, however, rejected the argument that Floyd's drug use or any underlying health conditions were to blame, saying it was the officer's knee that killed him. Minneapolis Police Dispatcher Jenna Scurry testified that she saw part of Floyd's arrest unfolding during a city surveillance camera and was so disturbed that she called a duty sergeant. Scurry said she grew concerned because the officers hadn't moved for several minutes. You can call me a snitch if you want to, Scurry said in her call to the sergeant, which was played in court. She said she wouldn't normally call the sergeant about the use of force because it was beyond the scope of her duties, but my instincts were telling me that something was wrong. The video played during opening statements was posted to Facebook by a bystander who witnessed Floyd being arrested after he was accused of trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill at a convenience store. Jurors watched intently as the video played on multiple screens, with one drawing a sharp breath as Floyd said he couldn't breathe. Chauvin sat quietly and took notes, looking up at the video periodically. My stomach hurts, my neck hurts, everything hurts, Floyd says in the video, and I can't breathe, officer. Onlookers repeatedly shouted at the officer to get off Floyd, saying he is not moving, breathing, or resisting. One woman, identifying herself as a city fire department employee, shouts at Chauvin to check Floyd's pulse. The prosecutor said the case was not about split-second decision-making by a police officer, but excessive force against someone who was handcuffed and not resisting. Blackwell said the fire department employee wanted to help, but was warned off by Chauvin, who pointed a mace at her. She wanted to check his pulse, check on Mr. Floyd's well-being, the prosecutor said. She did her best to intervene, she couldn't help. Now the timeline differs from the initial account submitted last May by prosecutors, who said Chauvin held his knee on Floyd's neck for 8 minutes 46 seconds. The time 8:46 soon became a rallying cry in the case, but it was revised during the investigation. 14 jurors or alternates are hearing the case, 8 of them white, 6 of them black or multiracial, according to the court. Only 12 will deliberate. The judge has not said which two will be alternates. Before the trial began, Floyd family attorney Ben Crump blasted the idea that the trial would be a tough test for jurors. We know that if George Floyd was an average white American citizen and he suffered this painful, torturous death with a police officer's knee on his neck, nobody would be saying this is a hard case, he said. After the day's proceedings, a few hundred protesters gathered outside the courthouse. Speakers called for justice for Floyd and others whose lives were lost in encounters with police. One speaker, Jailani Hussein, shouted, "Police officers are not above the law." The downtown Minneapolis courthouse has been fortified with concrete wires, fences, and barbed and razor wire. City and state leaders are determined to prevent a repeat of the riots that followed Floyd's death, with National Guard troops already mobilized. Chauvin's trial is being live-streamed over the objections of the prosecution. Judge Peter Cahill ordered that the cameras be allowed largely because of the pandemic and the required social distancing, which left almost no room for spectators in the courtroom. 3 other officers go on trial in August because Cahill said there wasn't enough space to try all 4 at once. And there's a link where you can find AP's full coverage of the death of George Floyd at apnews.com/hub/death-of-George-Floyd. Now, in a way, this is probably going to be a mix of Rodney King and O.J. Simpson. Rodney King because of the police officer standpoint, and we all know what happened after the first Rodney King trial. There was a riot in Los Angeles, and that led and that went on for a few days because the National Guard wasn't mobilized. And O.J. Simpson, in a sense that there are going to be a lot of people outside the courthouse, watching, and a lot of rallies and protests and whatnot. So, yeah, it'll be interesting with that. And there's this article from the USA Today. Derek Chauvin trial live opening statements to begin Monday after hundreds gathered to honor George Floyd's life by Liddy Dead At, Nancy Bragg, and Grace Hawk. Attorneys were expected to lay out their cases Monday in the murder trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who was charged in the death of George Floyd last month, an incident that ignited hundreds of protests worldwide against police brutality and touched off a racial reckoning in the U.S. In advance of opening statements, hundreds of people gathered at rallies and vigils on Sunday to honor Floyd's life and drew attention to the court proceedings. After Chauvin, and something was cut out, but it said that Chauvin, who was white, pinned his knee against Floyd's neck for more than 9 minutes. Chauvin is charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. If convicted of the most serious charge, he could face 10.5 years to 15 years in prison under sentencing guidelines for first-time offenders. Jury selection concluded last week after 11 days. Protesters, some chanting, drumming, and holding portraits of Floyd, demonstrated outside the courthouse throughout. Some said they planned to protest throughout the rest of the trial. On Sunday, the Reverend Billy G. Russell held an evening vigil at his church with members of Floyd's family, the Reverend Al Sharpton, and civil rights attorney Ben Crump. When he spoke Sunday, Sharpton pointed out that the many cases never resulted in criminal charges against the officers involved, citing past incidents including the beating of Rodney King and the killing of Eric Gardner. He said that Monday marks an opportunity for the country to hold police accountable. The criminal justice system is on trial, Sharpton said. Chauvin is in the courtroom, but America is on trial. Opening statements were scheduled to begin at 9 a.m. Central Time. Hennepin County Judge Peter Cahill has said that the trial could last up to 4 weeks. Over the last 3 weeks, 15 jurors were selected, 12 will deliberate, 2 will serve as alternates, and 1 will be dismissed if all the others show up for opening statements Monday. The panel includes 9 white jurors and 6 jurors of colors, including 3 black men, 1 black woman, and 2 mixed-race women. A limited number of people are allowed in the courtroom due to COVID-19, including 1 member each of Floyd and Chauvin's family. And how to watch opening statements of the Derek Chauvin trial. Chauvin's trial is being broadcast on Court TV, and USA Today is live streaming the court proceedings. Visual and audio recordings are not typically allowed in Minnesota courtrooms without authorization from a judge. Cahill upheld his decision to live stream the trial in December because of immense global interest in the case and limited courthouse space. What's happened so far? The judge and attorneys for the defense and prosecution have selected a jury and decided what evidence the jurors will be allowed to hear. Jury selection began in early March with an initial pool of more than 300 potential jurors who were asked to fill out a pretrial 13-page questionnaire about their prior knowledge of the case, the media exposure, and whether they could set aside pre-existing opinions while to serve as an impartial juror. The judge and attorneys spent 11 days interviewing jurors and ultimately selected 15. Chauvin was in the courtroom each day taking notes on a legal pad. The process faced some delays after Minneapolis announced a historic $27 million wrongful death lawsuit with Floyd's family. The defense tried to delay a one-move trial, arguing news coverage of the announcement tainted the jury. Hennepin County District Court Judge Peter Cahill denied these motions, but he dismissed 2 jurors who had been chosen already and excused 3 prospective jurors who said that they were swayed by the settlement. The judge also ruled that the jurors will be allowed to hear some evidence related to a prior arrest of Floyd. In a May 2019 arrest, police responded to information about illegal narcotics activity and found substantial amounts of drugs on and near Floyd according to court rulings. Cahill said that the arrest is remarkably similar to the fatal 2020 account, and that jurors can hear evidence from the 2019 arrest only related to Floyd's medical state, not his emotional behavior, since it pertains to the cause of death in the 2020 incident. And there's that. Like I say, I will be giving highlights of it probably once a week, probably on Friday as a little bit of a wrap up. But yeah, in the comment section below, let me know if you're going to be watching the George Floyd trial. Also, let me know what you think about what's happening with that, and I'll see you in the next video. Another talk show radio host had died yesterday. G. Gordon Liddy, who had a show on back about 2002 or so. He is the one of the prisoners from the Watergate hearing, and yeah, so G. Gordon Liddy passed away yesterday. This coming from the Political Insider. Watergate Mastermind and conservative talk radio legend G. Gordon Liddy dead at 90. G. Gordon Liddy, a re-election campaign operative for Richard Nixon in 1972, who played a role in the Watergate scandal, died at the age of 90 on Thursday. The death was confirmed by Liddy's son, Thomas. COVID-19 was not a factor in his death. Post-Watergate, Liddy went on to conservative talk radio fame. G. Gordon Liddy, conservative or chief operative behind Watergate scandal, dies at 90. And Watergate Mastermind Liddy, I do it again for my president. A former FBI agent, Liddy was known as a mastermind behind Watergate, the infamous plot to put water taps inside the Democratic National Committee's headquarters. After the plot was discovered, Liddy was arrested along with 6 others. Liddy spent 4 years in prison, convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping. He refused to testify before a Senate committee regarding his involvement. Years later, Liddy said, "I'd do it again for my president." As Congress began to impeach Nixon in 1974, Nixon resigned. Cameron Gray tweeted out, "So very sad to see the news that my former boss, G. Gordon Liddy, has passed away at age 90. He lived quite a life and gave me so much during our years together. R.I.P. GGL. Liddy became a popular nationally syndicated talk radio host. The Los Angeles Times reported upon his death. While others were swept up in the Watergate scandal, offered contrition, or screamed in the glare of televised congressional hearings, Liddy seemed to wear the crime like a badge of courage, saying he only regretted that the mission to break into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters had been a failure. In his post-prison life, Liddy became a popular talk show host and was known for making controversial remarks. Susan King tweeted out, G. Gordon Liddy, unrepentant Watergate burglar who became talk show host, has died, from the Los Angeles Times. Liddy never shied from controversy. During the federal government's raid on the Waco, Texas Ranch Davidian compound in 1993, Liddy told his listeners to target federal agents with headshots. Liddy would later say he wasn't advocating violence against federal agents, but believed anyone, regular American citizens, should be able to defend themselves and their liberties if confronted with deadly force. Liddy once appeared on Dave Letterman's show to talk about his past, including his lecture circuit with the infamous LSD guru Timothy Leary. In 2015, Liddy's wife died. He is survived by 5 children and a sister. Now, I listened to G. Gordon Liddy a couple of times, and controversial, yes, but then again, so too was Rush Limbaugh and Andrew Breitbart. But, and sometimes as former World Championship Wrestling executive and former WWE backstage executive and future WWE 2021 Hall of Fame inductee Eric Bischoff posted and entitled his book, Controversy Creates Cash, so this could bring some cash in, this did bring some cash over to Liddy's side, and, especially with his talk show and stuff, but yeah, there's this article also from the Associated Press. G. Gordon Liddy, Watergate Mastermind, dead at 90. G. Gordon Liddy, a mastermind of the Watergate burglary and a radio talk show host after emerging from prison, died Tuesday at age 90 at his daughter's home in Virginia. His son Thomas Liddy confirmed the death, but did not reveal the cause, other than to say that it was not related to COVID-19. Liddy, a former FBI agent and Army veteran, was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping for his role in the Watergate burglary, which led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. He spent 4 years and 4 months in prison, including more than 100 days in solitary confinement. "I'd do it again for my president," he said years later. Liddy was outspoken and controversial as a political operative under Nixon. He recommended assassinating political enemies, bombing a left-leaning think tank, and kidnapping war protesters. His White House colleagues ignored such suggestions. One of his ventures, a break-in at Democrat headquarters at the Watergate building in June 1972, was approved. The burglary went awry, which led to an investigation and cover-up and Nixon's resignation in 1974. Liddy was also convicted of conspiracy in the September 1971 burglary at the office of the psychiatrist of Daniel Ellsberg, the defense analyst who leaked the secret history of the Vietnam War known as the Pentagon Papers. After his release from prison, Liddy became a popular, provocative, and controversial radio talk show host. He also worked as a security consultant, writer, and actor. His appearance, piercing dark eyes, bushy mustache, and shaved head, made him a recognizable spokesman for products and TV guests. On air, he offered tips on how to kill federal firearms agents, rode around with car tags saying H2O Watergate, and scorned people who cooperated with prosecutors. Born in Hoboken, New Jersey, George Gordon Battle Liddy was a frail boy who grew up in a neighborhood populated mostly by German Americans. From friends that he made who was a German national, Liddy developed a curiosity about German leader Adolf Hitler and was inspired by listening to Hitler's radio speeches in the 1930s. If an entire nation could be changed, lifted out of weakness to extraordinary strength, so could one person. Liddy wrote in Will, his autobiography. His personal story was intriguing enough that Will was the basis of a TV movie in 1982 starring Robert Conrad. As a boy, Liddy decided it was critical to face his fears and overcome them. At age 11, he roasted a rat and ate it to overcome his fear of rats. From now on, rats could fear me as they fear cats, he wrote. After attending Fordham University and serving a stint in the Army, Liddy graduated from the Fordham University Law School and then joined the FBI. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress from New York in 1968 and helped organize Nixon's presidential campaign in the state. When Nixon took office, Liddy was named as a special assistant to Treasury and served under Treasury Secretary David M. Kennedy. He later moved to the White House and in Nixon's re-election campaign, where his official title was General Counsel. Liddy was head of a team of Republican operatives known as the Plumbers, whose mission was to find leakers of information embarrassing to the Nixon administration. Among Liddy's specialties were gathering political intelligence and organizing activities to disrupt or discredit Nixon's Democrat opponents. I guess I had to get a little liquid refreshment in there. No worries, it's water. While recruiting a woman to help carry out one of his schemes, Liddy tried to convince her that no one could force him to reveal her identity to anyone else against his will. To convince her, he held his hand over a flaming cigarette lighter. His hand was badly burned. The woman turned down the job. Liddy became known for such offbeat suggestions as kidnapping war protest organizers and taking them to Mexico during the Republican National Convention, assassinating investigative journalist Jack Anderson, and firebombing the Brookings Institution, a left-leaning think tank in Washington, where classified documents leaked by Ellsberg were being stored. Liddy and fellow operative Howard Hunt, along with the 5 arrested at Watergate, were indicted on federal charges 3 months after the June 1972 break-in. Hunt and his recruits pleaded guilty in January 1973, and James McCord and Liddy were found guilty. Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974. After the failed break-in attempt, Liddy recalled telling White House counsel John Dean, "If someone wants to shoot me, just tell me what corner to stand in and I'll be there, okay?" Dean reportedly responded, "I don't think we've gotten that far yet, Gordon." Liddy claimed in an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes that Nixon was insufficiently ruthless and should have destroyed tape recordings of his conversations with top aides. Liddy learned to market his reputation as a fearless, if sometimes overzealous, advocate of conservative causes. His syndicated radio talk show broadcast from Virginia-based WJFK was long one of the most popular in the country. He wrote best-selling books, acted in TV shows like Miami Vice, was a frequent guest lecturer on college campuses, started a private eye franchise, and worked as a security consultant. For a time, he teamed on the lecture circuit with an unlikely partner, 1960s LSD guru Timothy Leary. In the mid-90s, Liddy told gun-toting radio listeners to aim for the head when encountered by the agents of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. Headshots, he stressed, explaining that most agents wear bullet-resistant vests under their jackets. Liddy said later he wasn't encouraging people to hunt agents, but added that if an agent comes at someone with deadly force, you should defend yourself and your rights with deadly force. Liddy always took pride in his role in Washington. He once said, "I'm proud of the fact that I am the guy who did not talk." One of the things that Liddy also did was, he regularly made fun of the Washington Post, calling it the Washington Bleep, because according to an interview that I had read somewhere, the words Washington and Post do not belong together, or something to that extent. But yeah, so G. Gordon Liddy was a mastermind. He was controversial, but then again, who isn't controversial? And there's this article from the Washington Examiner on Liddy's death, and it says, Watergate mastermind G. Gordon Liddy dies at age 90. G. Gordon Liddy, the former FBI official who helped orchestrate the 1972 break-in at the Watergate complex under orders from President Richard Nixon, has died at the age of 90. Liddy died yesterday or Tuesday at his daughter's home in Fairfax County, Virginia, according to the Washington Post, which said his son, Thomas P. Liddy, confirmed the death but did not comment on a cause other than to say it was not related to COVID-19. Initially recognizable for his bushy mustache and immortalized as the Sphinx of Watergate for his silence during the Watergate scandal, Liddy was a polarizing figure in American politics who served more than 4 years in prison for his role in the raid of the Democrat National Committee headquarters. His story, inexorably intertwined with Nixon's, has taken on renewed significance in recent years as another former president, Donald Trump, faced an impeachment inquiry and is consistently compared to Tricky Dick for the controversies he faces and his aggressive tactics employed to attack political rivals in the press. In the later years of his life, Liddy wrote an autobiography about his life and work for Nixon, spent 2 decades as a radio talk show host, and made appearances in movies and popular TV shows. Liddy was born in Brooklyn on November 30th, 1930, and was named after George Gordon Battle, a New York lawyer who became a Tammany Hall leader. His father, Sylvester, was also a lawyer. Liddy graduated from Fordham University before serving 2 years as an Army artillery officer in the Korean War. After being honorably discharged, Liddy returned to New York City and attended Fordham Law School. Liddy joined the FBI in 1957 and worked as an agent for roughly 5 years under J. Edgar Hoover. And around this time, he got married to Frances Ann Purcell. After resigning from the Bureau, Liddy returned to New York City to work as a lawyer, and during the 1960s ran unsuccessfully for district attorney and a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. In the early 1970s, Liddy took on roles in the Nixon administration and became one of the president's top lieutenants as a member of the Plumbers, a secretive White House group created in response to the publication of the Pentagon Papers. In the summer of 1972, after Liddy became general counsel to Nixon's re-election campaign, he was ordered to plan the break-in at the DNC headquarters housed in the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. He and former CIA official Howard Hunt were in a room in the nearby Watergate Hotel, set up to be a listening post when 5 burglars were apprehended, attempting to replace a faulty wiretap. Although he and Hunt evaded authorities, Liddy was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and wiretapping for his role in the raid, and was sentenced to 20 years in prison and dealt $40,000 in fines. But he only served about 4.5 years behind bars when President Jimmy Carter commuted his sentence, citing equity and fairness compared to his co-defendants in the Watergate case. Liddy published a best-selling autobiography in 1980 entitled Will, in which he offered insight into his life and work for Nixon, including discussions about assassinating columnist Jack Anderson, who has published embarrassing stories about Nixon. He also opened up about his refusal to talk during the Watergate investigations and his loyalty to Nixon, who resigned in August 1974 in the face of almost certain impeachment. I had at least the knowledge that my silence had helped bring him more than two additional years as president, Liddy wrote. In the years that followed, Liddy became a lecturer, the host of a popular nationally syndicated conservative talk show, and author of several books. He also acted in films and TV shows including Miami Vice and MacGyver. Liddy had 5 children with his wife Frances and at least 12 grandchildren. Frances died in 2010. And there's also this from the USA Today. G. Gordon Liddy, Watergate Mastermind, dead at 80. Good picture of Liddy there. G. Gordon Liddy, a mastermind of the Watergate burglary and a radio talk show host after emerging from prison, died Tuesday at age 90. His son, Thomas Liddy, confirmed the death but did not reveal the cause other than to say that it was not related to COVID-19. Liddy, a former FBI and Army veteran, was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping for his role in the Watergate burglary, which led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. He spent 4 years and 4 months in prison, including more than 100 days in solitary confinement. "I'd do it again for my president," he said years later. After his release, Liddy became a popular, often provocative radio talk show host. He also worked as a security consultant, writer, and actor. Liddy was outspoken and controversial, both as a political operative under Nixon and as a radio personality. Liddy recommended assassinating political enemies, bombing a left-leaning think tank, and kidnapping war protesters. His White House colleagues ignored such suggestions. One of his ventures, a break-in at Democrat headquarters at the Watergate building in June 1972, was approved. The burglary went awry, which led to an investigation to cover up Nixon's resignation in 1974. Liddy, a former FBI and Army veteran, was convicted of conspiracy, burglary, and illegal wiretapping for his role in the Watergate burglary. He was also convicted of burglary in the September 1971 burglary, or convicted of conspiracy in the September 1971 burglary of defense analyst David Ellsberg, psychiatrist who leaked the secret history of the Vietnam War known as the Pentagon Papers. And it goes on to pretty much what I had read in future articles. So we're in recent articles on this, so I'll stop it right here. But yeah, G. Gordon Liddy, dead at age 90. You know, may he rest in peace. And who knows if he and Rush Limbaugh were on good terms, but you know, I would imagine that the pearly gates are going to be a lot more controversial, well, not controversial, but they're definitely going to be a lot more entertaining with Liddy and Rush Limbaugh up there. Let me know in the comment below what you think about G. Gordon Liddy. Did you listen to his radio show? And did you watch him on any TV? What were your impressions of him? And I'll see you in the next video. I've been saying in the past that the mainstream media is not our friend and that they're spreading lies and falsehoods. And perfect example came from Lester Holt from NBC yesterday. This coming from thehill.com, and the title is NBC's Lester Holt warns media against giving platform for misinformation. There's a YouTube video there. It's a pretty long YouTube, so I'm not going to play it. Lester Holt, the anchor of NBC Nightly News, argued this week that news organizations and the journalists they employ should do everything they can to call out misinformation permeating the political media ecosystem and separate facts from falsehoods forcefully to combat that trend. I think it's become clear that fairness is overrated, Holt said Tuesday as he accepted the Edward R. Murrow Award for Lifetime Achievement in Journalism. Before you run off and tweet that headline, let me explain a bit. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. That the sun sets in the west is a fact. Any contrary review does not deserve our time or attention. Holt referenced recent events like the January 6 rioting by supporters of former President Trump and conspiracy theories that have gone online about the coronavirus pandemic as examples of moments that require journalists to dismiss falsehoods and focus on provable truths. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal coverage time and not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda, Holt said. In fact, it's just the opposite, providing an open platform for misinformation for anyone to come and say whatever they want, whatever they may, especially when issues of public health and safety are at stake, can be quite dangerous, he said. Our duty is to be fair to the truth. We need to hear our leaders' views, their policies, and reasoning. It's really important, but we have to stand ready to push back and call out falsehoods. Holt has served as the anchor of NBC Nightly News since 2015, joining the network in the 2000s and working as weekend anchor and host of Today and other NBC News programs. The anchor spoke about the morphing responsibilities of major media companies to build relationships with their audiences, but not let popularity among viewers and readers stand in the way of reporting uncomfortable truths. He acknowledged the sentiment that he was expressing about any departure from total objectivity in reporting might reinforce negative sentiment some hold about journalists. That we have to be more direct in our language in recent times only speaks to the volume and gravity of particular statements and claims, Holt said. Fact-checking is not a vendetta. We all have a stake in getting it right. And there's also this from Fox News. NBC's Lester Holt says we don't need to hear both sides to define truth. Fairness is overrated. NBC News anchor Lester Holt received praise from liberal media figures after saying reporters don't need to hear both sides of a story before determining the truth. I think it's become clear that fairness is overrated. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in, Holt said on Tuesday night while accepting an award at the 45th Euro Symposium. As the sun sets in the west is a fact, any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention, Holt continued. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's the opposite. Holt then said providing an open platform for misinformation, for anyone to come say whatever they want, especially when issues of public health and safety are at risk, can be quite dangerous. Before declaring the duty of reporters is to be fair to the truth. Holt's comments conjure up memories of CNN's Don Lemon dismissing Trump supporters during a January rant about alleged election interference. Lemon mocked GOP lawmakers' claims that they opposed President Biden's Electoral College victory on behalf of millions of Trump supporters and their concerns about claims of voter fraud and irregularities. So stop saying that we must respect Trump supporters who believe bullcrap because it's bullcrap that you've been feeding them. The president and you've been feeding them the BS, and now they believe it again. Another self-fulfilling prophecy and feedback loop, Lemon said. Critics of Holt's approach saw his comments as essentially a dog whistle to liberal reporters who see themselves as the arbiters of truth and therefore can cover the truth from a one-sided perspective with the approval of NBC's top anchor. Cornell Law School professor and media critic William A. Jacobson didn't think Holt's remarks applied to the modern world, where outspoken liberals are often working as journalists. In a better world in which the mainstream major media has a history of fairness and nonpartisanship, Holt's point that journalism inherently involves filtering information might make sense. This is not such a better world. This is a world in which the mainstream major media wears its partisanship on its sleeve, manipulating the news cycle to the advantage of Democrats, Jacobson told Fox News. In the real world, Holt's advice simply justifies media political bias. While Jacobson isn't a fan of Holt's comments, many liberal media watchdogs cheered him on. Left-wing New York University journalism professor Jay Rosen felt Holt's comments were a reason to celebrate. When the chief anchor of one of the major networks agrees that both siding everything is bad practice, critics have finally won a point and they should celebrate, Rosen tweeted. Rosen followed up, someone like Lester Holt is the center of gravity among news workers, and if he thinks it's okay not to both sides everything, that can influence thought and behavior across a lot of desks. CNN's left-leaning reliable sources media newsletter highlighted Holt's remarks as a sharp critique of both sidesism, a notable turn of a phrase from a reporting team that almost completely reverses its criticisms for right-leaning outlets, including calls for censorship. Outspoken liberal CNN White House correspondent John Herdwood simply wrote thank you to Holt. Media Research Center executive editor Tim Graham mocked Holt's comments by sharing a 2017 report detailing the NBC News anchor admitting to Hillary Clinton that he winced when she was called dishonest. Holt replaced Brian Williams as anchor of NBC Nightly News in 2015 after Williams admitted to lying about an Iraq War story he told for years. He was suspended without pay for 6 months, but eventually returned as an anchor for MSNBC, which is NBC's left-wing cable affiliate. Now, Andrew Breitbart had said many times in the past that the mainstream media is not our friend. They parrot basically almost everything from the left-leaning sources. They even have support and backing from George Soros, and they use the Saul Alinsky playbook. So what Holt said don't surprise me any. As a matter of fact, there's this article from The Federalist which sums it up rather nicely. Lester Holt's fairness is overrated. Rant accentuates journalism's corruption. In accepting the Edward Murrow for a lifetime achievement in journalism on Tuesday, NBC News anchor Lester Holt gave a monologue on why fairness in journalism is overrated. I think it's become clear that fairness is overrated, Holt said. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in. That the sun sets in the west is a fact. Any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite. The Daily Caller tweeted that out also. Holt is squarely admitting what those on the right have recognized for quite some time. The left is no longer comfortable embracing liberal principles like equality of opportunity and instead has grown to be quite authoritarian. The NBC anchor's embracement of censorship surely ought to take any constitutionally minded American or lover of freedom aback. In addition, his words align with the frightening sentiment brewing among Democrats that the other side must be muzzled at all costs. While House Republicans continue sending letters to no avail to billionaire big tech CEOs demanding censorship initiatives be de-escalated, it is important to take note of what the other side is doing. Not only has the left encouraged social media platforms to continue removing conservative voices, but House Democrats on the Energy and Commerce Committee wrote letters to 12 cable, satellite, and streaming companies demanding Fox News, Newsmax, One American News, and others be taken off the air due solely to the political views they host. The prolonged severity of the COVID-19 pandemic and the attack on our Capitol on January 6 have driven home a frightening reality that the spread of disinformation and extremism by traditional news media presents a tangible and destabilizing threat, said Representatives Frank Pallone of New Jersey and Mike Doyle of Pennsylvania. Holt claimed that providing an open platform for misinformation, for anyone to come say whatever they want, especially when issues of public health and safety are at stake, can be quite dangerous. Now, it's worth noting that Holt said this before claiming the duty of a journalist is to hold those in power accountable and to be fair to the truth. Now, if you notice, the anchor wholly contradicts himself in this statement. If, in fact, it is Holt's understanding that journalism ought to be one-sided and organized solely by those he deems not spreading disinformation, it is incoherent for Holt to also claim journalism centers on being fair to the truth. Fairness is an apparently obsolete term in his twisted worldview, so why would he have any commitment to fairness when holding elected officials accountable and letting the American people search for truth in many places? But the answer is quite simple, really. The legacy media, NBC, CNN, ABC, the New York Times, and so forth, are less concerned with searching for truth than being the arbiters of it. This could not have been better illustrated than when CNN's Brian Stelter said, "Freedom of speech is different than freedom of reach," and encouraged reducing information pollution in January. It is not shocking to the slightest either that CNN White House correspondent John Harwood would thank Holt for his monologue, or that Brian Stelter and Oliver Darcy's newsletter would plainly say that the NBC News anchor delivered a sharp tongue of both sidesism as opposed to a critique on the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, Holt is the same journalist who put on an interview for Political Theater with then-presidential candidate Hillary Clinton in 2016, asking her if her feelings got hurt when she gets in political battles. Holt said he wins when he heard a boy at a recent CNN town hall tell Clinton she was dishonest. Why did Holt wince when hearing not every American prescribes to his preferred orthodoxy that puts Democrats on a pedestal? He did so because of his assumption that he and his legacy media allies are untouchable. It turns out gatekeepers do not much like being questioned because it inherently disrupts their purpose for crafting the very narrative that there is only one side worth listening to in American politics. This side, the left, will do just about anything to ensure the show goes on and the curtains never get yanked open. We need to hear our leaders' views, their policies, and reasoning. It's really important, Holt said, but we have to stand ready to push back and call out falsehoods. Holt qualifies that our leaders must be heard, presumably to sound as if he stands for democratic principles, and then moves to claim misinformation must be taken to war. But truly, the NBC anchor by no means believes in giving leaders a platform to speak. If he did, he would have stood against his power-hungry corporate media allies in their support for censoring the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world. The jargon about how it's really important to hear our leaders' views makes for dramatic television, but it is a far cry from failing to voice opposition over Trump and other Republicans being removed from internet platforms. Do not forget, though, The ruling journalist class does not wish to be questioned, challenged, or proven wrong. Look no further than how a race and inclusion editor at USA Today claimed victimhood upon being fired for derogatory comments, or the media's horror when Glenn Greenwald challenged the viewpoint of a USA Today intern for a controversial article on the Capitol breach. What is most irritating about all of Holt's monologue, or of all about Holt's monologue, is his tone and the way he delivers its anti-democratic opposition with a straight face. To the corporate media shills who are running this country, truth only moves in one direction, from themselves and their inflated egos down to the rest of us. And that's totally true. I mean, you know, look, we can look no further than Project Veritas and James O'Keefe. In fact, James O'Keefe, on his videos, has a retraction of, I think, the day or the week when he gets when one of the major media outlets on the left, skewers him and defames him, and he calls them out on it, and they retract their statement. In fact, I want to say he's up to about 400 retractions, most of them from the Washington Post. I think the New York Times is a close second, but yeah, check it out. It's on Project Media's YouTube, I think, or if they still have that up. But there's also this from the Washington Examiner. NBC anchor says fairness is overrated and media should not provide an open platform for misinformation. NBC anchor Lester Holt said fairness is overrated when accepting the Edward R. Murrow Award for Lifetime Achievement in Journalism. I think it's become clear that fairness is overrated. The idea that we should always give two sides equal weight and merit does not reflect the world we find ourselves in, Holt said Tuesday evening. As the sun sets in the west, it's a fact. Any contrary view does not deserve our time or attention, Holt continued. Decisions to not give unsupported arguments equal time are not a dereliction of journalistic responsibility or some kind of agenda. In fact, it's just the opposite. He also railed against providing an open platform for misinformation, saying that allowing anyone to come say whatever they want, especially when issues of public health and safety are at stake, can be quite dangerous. His comments were highlighted in CNN's Reliable Sources newsletter as a sharp critique of both sidesism, while New York University journalism professor James J. Rosen said on Twitter that they were cause to celebrate. When the chief anchor of one of the major networks agrees that both sides think everything is bad practice, critics have finally won a point and they should celebrate, Rosen tweeted. Others on social media also praised the comments. However, Media Research Executive Editor Tim Graham mocked the statements. Lester Holt, we can't allow an open platform for misinformation, Graham tweeted. Also, Lester provides open platform for Hillary, says he wins when someone called her dishonest. Asked her, do you get your feelings hurt sometimes? The comments come after a poll found that the public's trust in the media hit an all-time low this year. Just 46 people trust traditional news media, and trust in social media has plummeted to 27%, according to a barometer published by Axios in January. In addition, 56% of the poll respondents said they agreed with the statement. Journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things that they know are false or gross exaggerations. Now, let me just take a look at that barometer right quick here and see just what it says here. Yes, folks, we are indeed live on this. This is from Axios back in 2020, back in January of this year. So let me pull this up. And it says, media trust hits new low. Trust in traditional media has declined to an all-time low, and many news professionals are determined to do something about it. Why it matters, faith in society's central institutions especially in government and the media, is the glue that holds society together. That glue was visibly dissolving a decade ago and has now, for many millions of Americans, disappeared entirely. By the numbers, for the first time ever, fewer than half of all Americans have trust in traditional media, according to data from Middleman's annual trust barometer shared exclusively with Axios. Trust in social media has hit an all-time low of 27%. 56% of Americans agree with the statement that journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. 58% think that most news organizations are most concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than with informing the public. When Edelman repolled Americans after the election, the figures had deteriorated even further, with 57% of Democrats trusting the media and only 18% of Republicans. And here's a graph from 2012 all the way to today. The big picture, these numbers are echoed across the rest of the world. They're mostly not a function of Donald Trump's war on fake news. As vaccine rumor hunter Heidi Larson puts it, we don't have a misinformation problem, we have a trust problem. News organizations have historically relied mainly on advertising income, and as those dollars flow increasingly to Google and Facebook, that has created institutional weakness that shows up in trust data. Reversing the decline is a monster task, and one that some journalists and news organizations have taken upon themselves. They're going to need help, perhaps from America's CEOs. Here's the catch. Mistrust of media is now a central part of many Americans' personal identity, an article of faith that they were argued into and can't be argued out of. What they're saying, former Financial Times editor Lionel Barber talks of factual reporting as a means of regaining the trust of the reading public. Axios has a stated mission to help restore trust in fact-based news. Washington Post media columnist Margaret Sullivan writes that our goal should go beyond merely putting truthful information in front of the public. We should also do our best to make sure it's widely accepted. Here's how it works. Media outlets can continue to report reliable facts, but that won't turn the trend around on its own. What's needed is for trusted institutions to visibly embrace the news media. CEOs, aka the fourth branch of government, are at or near the top of Edelman's list of trusted institutions. By the numbers, 61% of Trump voters say they trust their employer CEO. That compares to just 28% who trust government leaders and a mere 21% who trust journalists. Bottom line, CEOs have long put themselves forward as a people able to upgrade America's physical infrastructure. Now it's time for them to use the trust they built to help rebuild our civic infrastructure. And that's that article. Now there's one from Edelman, so let's check that out. And it says, yep, that's the same thing. Here we are, the raging trust crisis and its consequences. This by Sarah Fisher. Americans are losing trust in leaders across every area of their lives and the information coming from every source of their news. According to the 21st Annual Edelman Trust Barometer out Wednesday, by the way, this was posted on January 13, 2021. So it was prior to January 13, which measures trust in institutions globally. But here's why it matters. The sobering report shows that people crave facts more than ever, but most have bad habits and a growing distrust of everything from journalists to vaccines and contact tracing. Details across every type of institution, media, government, business, and NGOs. Trust has fallen to historic lows, according to the report. Business is the only institution that is now being perceived as being both ethical and competent enough to solve the world's problems. CEOs are the only societal leaders trusted to tell the truth and fix problems. The trust deficit has gotten so bad that people don't know who or what to believe anymore, and they don't even trust themselves to get facts right. A majority of people around the world believe that journalists, government leaders, and business leaders are all purposely trying to mislead people by spreading misinformation. Most people have terrible information hygiene and admit that they don't actively verify information. avoid echo chambers, or share things without first vetting information. Here's a big picture, the 2021 Trust Barometer titled Declaring Information Bankruptcy offers one of the bleakest pictures of societal trust globally in the past 2 decades, thanks in large part to the coronavirus pandemic. The data shows that even the most powerful countries like the US, China, Germany, and the UK are experiencing a record trust deficit, especially in government. Trust in government in the US has crashed following the 2020 election, especially among Republicans. That trust gap has real world consequences. Only 59% of people in the US say they are willing to take the vaccine if it becomes available to them within a year. Those who are willing to take the vaccine tend to have poor information hygiene. What to watch? The data suggests that two of the biggest global economies, the US and China, have fallen below India as now the most trusting company in the world. Neither the US or China have the trust capital they need to be global leaders in this time of multiple crises, per the report. And that's that, and that's totally true. Andrew Breitbart had said it out, and that's why, as I've said many times, the left is playing by the Saul Alinsky playbook, using Saul Alinsky's tactics, particularly Rule 13, which is identify the target, freeze, and polarize it. What we need to do is use tactics that Andrew Breitbart had put out before he died, and there is in his book, Righteous Indignation. And one of these days, I'm definitely going to do a video on that. In the comment below, let me know if you trust the media. Also, let me know what you think about the articles. Should we trust the media? What what does the legacy media need to do in order to regain your trust? And I'll see you in the next video. The Derek Chauvin trial is in day 5, and there were a lot of updates yesterday. Let's get right into it. This from the Associated Press, entitled, Lieutenant Kneeling on Floyd's Neck Was Totally Unnecessary. Kneeling on George Floyd's neck while he was handcuffed and in the prone position was top-tier deadly force and totally unnecessary, the head of the Minneapolis Police Department's Homicide Division testified Friday. If your knee is on a person's neck, that can kill him, said Lieutenant Richard Zimmerman, adding that when a person is handcuffed in the prone position, your muscles are pulling back, and if you're lying on your chest, that's constricting your breathing even more. Zimmerman also testified at Derek Chauvin's murder trial that once Floyd was handcuffed, he saw no reason for why the officers felt they were in danger if that's what they felt, and that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force. So in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and thrown to the ground? Prosecutor Matthew Frank asked. Absolutely, Zimmerman replied. He also testified that officers have a duty to provide care for a person in distress, even if an ambulance has already been called. Under cross-examination, Chauvin attorney Eric Nelson peppered Zimmerman with questions about use of force, pointing out that officers must consider the entire situation about this when deciding about whether to use force, including what is happening with a suspect, whether the suspect is under the influence, or the surrounding hazards such as a crowd. Zimmerman agreed with Nelson that a person who is handcuffed can still pose a threat and can continue to thrash around. His testimony came a day after a Minneapolis police supervisory sergeant who was on duty the night Floyd died said he believes the officers restrained him for too long. David Pleoger testified Thursday that officers are trained to hold people on their side in order to help with their breathing after they have been restrained in the prone position. He said the officers could have ended their restraint of Floyd after he stopped resisting. Chauvin, who is 45 and white, is accused of killing Floyd by putting his knee on the 46-year-old black man's neck for 9 minutes 29 seconds as he lay face down in handcuffs. Floyd had been accused of passing a counterfeit $20 bill at a neighborhood market. His death triggered large protests around the U.S., scattered violence, and widespread soul-searching over racism and police brutality. The since-fired Chauvin is charged with murder and manslaughter, and most serious charge him carries up to 40 years in prison. On Friday, Minneapolis Police Sergeant John Edwards, an overnight supervisor the night Floyd died, said he secured the scene at the request of Ploeger, who was still at the hospital with Floyd. Edwards said Ploeger told him the encounter had the potential to become a critical incident, which could mean someone died or was seriously injured. The defense has argued that Chauvin did what he was trained to do when he encountered Floyd last May, and that Floyd's death was caused not by the knee on his neck, as prosecutors contend, but by drugs, his underlying health conditions, and adrenaline. An autopsy found fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. On Wednesday, two paramedics who arrived at the scene that day said they saw no signs that Floyd was breathing or moving. One of them, Derek Smith, testified that he checked for a pulse and couldn't detect one. In layman's terms, I thought he was dead. And I've seen bits and pieces of it. You know, like I keep saying, the only real news that I get from the George Floyd, or rather Derek Chauvin murder trial, is what I read in my news briefings. But yeah, so it's interesting to see just what is coming out of this and coming out in the open. You know, there are some people who say that the police department, or that it wasn't an ambulance that Floyd was put in, but a paddy wagon. And I mean, that is highly unlikely, but in any event, it is what it is. But there is this also from Fox News on the George Floyd, on this case. Chauvin told bystander Floyd was a sizable guy, probably on something. After the ambulance took George Floyd away, the Minneapolis officer who had pinned his knee on the black man's neck defended himself to a bystander by saying that Floyd was a sizable guy and probably on something, according to police video played in court Wednesday. The video was part of a mountain of footage, both official and amateur, and witness testimony at Officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial that all together showed how Floyd's alleged attempt to pass a phony $20 bill at a neighborhood market last May escalated into tragedy. One video documented a step at a time. A security camera scene of people joking around inside the store soon gave way to the sight of officers pulling Floyd from his SUV at gunpoint, struggling to push him into a squad car as he writhed and screamed that he was claustrophobic, and then putting him on the pavement. When Floyd was finally taken away by paramedics, Charles McMillan, a 61-year-old bystander who recognized Chauvin from the neighborhood, told the officer he didn't respect what Chauvin had done. That's one person's opinion. Chauvin could be heard responding, "We gotta control this guy because he's a sizable guy, and he looks like he's probably on something." Floyd was 6'4" and 233 pounds, according to the autopsy, which also found fentanyl and methamphetamine in his system. Chauvin's lawyers said the officer is 5'9", 140. Chauvin, 45, is charged with murder and manslaughter, accused of killing the 46-year-old Floyd by kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes 29 seconds as he lay face down in handcuffs. The most serious charge against an off-fired white officer carries up to 40 years in prison. Floyd's death, along with a harrowing bystander video of him gasping for breath as onlookers yelled at Chauvin to get off him, triggered sometimes violent protests around the world and a reckoning over racism and police brutality across the U.S. Jurors were shown police body camera video of the approximately 20 minutes between when police approached Floyd's vehicle and when he was loaded into the ambulance. When Officer Thomas Lane confronted Floyd in his SUV, drew his gun and demanded with a few expletives that he showed her his hands. A panicky sounding Floyd said, I'm sorry, and I got shot before." Seemingly crying, he begged repeatedly, "Please don't shoot me, man." Then, when told to get in the squad car, Floyd repeatedly yelled, "I'm not that kind of guy, and I'm claustrophobic." As officers shoved his upper body and then his legs into the car, he writhed and screamed, "Please, please, I can't breathe." Officers were clearly exasperated when Floyd braced himself against the squad car and arched his body while they tried to get him inside. At one point, he threw his upper body out of the car, and officers tried to push him back in. Officers eventually pulled him out and brought him to the ground. Floyd thanked officers as they took him out of the squad car. Once Floyd was on the ground with Chauvin's knee on his neck, another officer's knee on his back, and a third man holding his legs, the officer talked calmly about whether he might be on drugs. Lane was heard saying officers found a weed pipe on Floyd and wondered if he might be on PCP, saying Floyd's eyes were shaking back and forth fast. He wouldn't get out of the car. He just wasn't following instructions. Lane was recorded saying, the officer also asked twice if the officer should roll Floyd on his side, and later said calmly that he thought Floyd was passing out. Another officer checked Floyd's wrist for a pulse and said he couldn't find one. Minutes later, as Floyd was pinned down by Chauvin and other officers, McMillan, the bystander, can be heard on the video saying to Floyd, "You can win, and get up and get in the car." Floyd replied, "I can't." The defense has argued that Chauvin did what he was trained to do and that Floyd's death was not caused by the officer's knee, as prosecutors contend, but by Floyd's illegal drug use, heart disease, high blood pressure, and the adrenaline flowing through his body. Events spun out of control earlier that day, soon after Floyd allegedly handed a cashier at Cup Foods, a 19-year-old Christopher Martin, a counterfeit bill for a pack of cigarettes. Martin testified Wednesday that he watched Floyd's arrest outside with disbelief and guilt. "If I would have just not taken the bill, this would have been avoided," Martin lamented, joining the burgeoning list of witnesses who expressed a sense of helplessness and lingering guilt over Floyd's death. Martin said he immediately believed the $20 bill was fake, but said he accepted it, despite believing the amount would be taken out of his paycheck by his employer because he didn't think Floyd knew it was counterfeit. "And I thought I'd be doing him a favor." Martin then second-guessed his decision and told a manager, who sent Martin outside to ask Floyd to return to the store, but Floyd and a passenger in his SUV twice refused to go back into the store to resolve the issue, and a manager had a coworker call police, Martin testified. Martin said that when Floyd was inside the store buying cigarettes, he spoke so slowly, it would appear that he was high, but he described Floyd as friendly and talkative. After police arrived, Martin went outside as people were gathering on the curb and yelling at officers. He said he saw Officer Tao Thao push one of his co-workers. Martin said he was also held back. Martin said that he also held back another man who was trying to defend himself after being pushed by Thao. Wednesday morning's testimony was briefly interrupted when a juror stood and raised her hand and gestured toward the door. She later told the judge that she had been feeling stressed and had trouble sleeping, but told the judge she was okay to proceed. Now things are all coming out, and this is basically relatively tame as opposed to what happened in the early 90s with Rodney King, but yeah, so, and there are some takeaways from yesterday's trial testimony. So and this from Reuters. 3 takeaways from Thursday's testimony at Derek Chauvin's trial. Here are 3 takeaways from Thursday's testimony at the trial of former Minneapolis policeman Derek Chauvin, accused of killing George Floyd, a black man whose death in May led to protests against racial injustice in cities worldwide. Number 1, Floyd's girlfriend, Courtney Ross, 45, testified that they were a loving couple who struggled with an addiction to painkillers. Chauvin's lawyers argue Floyd's death was a result of an overdose, but the Floyd family's lawyer said in a statement, "Tens of thousands of Americans struggle with self-medication and opioid abuse and are treated with dignity, respect, and support, not brutality." Months later, the county medical examiner ruled the death a homicide at the hands of police, even though an autopsy found fentanyl in Chauvin's blood, or rather Floyd's blood. Chauvin told retired Minneapolis Police Sergeant David Ploger in a brief phone conversation that Floyd was combative during the deadly incident, according to a recording of the call played at the trial. "We just had to hold the guy. We just had to hold a guy down who was going crazy on the back of the passenger floor," Chauvin was heard telling Ploger. Testifying on Thursday, Ploger said Chauvin later acknowledged having knelt on Floyd or his neck. Number 3, paramedics who arrived at the scene testified that they had to move police off Floyd, who by then had stopped breathing, had no pulse, and whose pupils were dilated. In lay terms, paramedic Derek Smith told the jury, "I thought he was dead." And there's this from BizPac Review. George Floyd's former girlfriend details history of drug use at trial. Much of the media focus on the 4th day of the trial for former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was on the testimony of George Floyd's former girlfriend. Chauvin is facing murder and manslaughter charges in the death of Floyd, who died after being detained by the police in May 2020, with Chauvin kneeling on his neck as he laid face down in handcuffs. The defense argument is the former officer was following his training and that Floyd's death was because of illegal drug use, underlying health conditions, and the adrenaline flowing through his body, Fox News reported. Fentanyl and methamphetamine were found in his system during an autopsy. Floyd had tested positive for COVID-19 in April and again following his death. Floyd's former girlfriend, Courtney Ross, offered emotional testimony about how they met at a Salvation Army shelter and talked about his shared history of narcotics addiction and drug abuse. Both Floyd and I, our story, it's a classic story of how many people get addicted to opioids. We both suffered from chronic pain. Mine was in my neck and his was in his back, Ross said. We both had prescriptions, but after prescriptions were filled, and we got addicted and tried really hard to break that addiction many times. Ross was a prosecution witness, and she said they used drugs on and off throughout their 3-year relationship, and explained that Floyd was overdosed in March 2020. She said Floyd used OxyContin and that they had purchased narcotics from Maurice Lester Hall, whose name has also been spelled Maurice. As Fox News noted, Hall was a passenger in Floyd's car when the police approached him on May 25, 2020. Police were called over Floyd allegedly trying to pass a counterfeit bill. Seen as a key witness, Hall's attorney said in court papers filed on Wednesday that he would invoke the Fifth Amendment if called to testify. Ross said she had reason to suspect that Floyd was using drugs around the time of his death, and that she was on the phone with Floyd a week before he died, and that he was allegedly buying drugs. She recognized the voice in the background as Hall's. When Floyd was being held on by police, he could be heard calling for Mama, but he may have been thinking of Ross rather than his mother. The media narrative is that he was crying out for his mother. Floyd can be heard repeatedly calling out Mama in video footage of the incident, saying, "Mama, I love you. Tell my kids I love them." During cross-examination, Ross said that Floyd's pet name for her in his phone was Mama. As for when they met, Ross said she was crying in the lobby of the Salvation Army. When Floyd came up and asked, "You okay, sis?" Floyd was working as a security guard at the shelter at the time. "I was not okay," she said. "I was just waiting for my son's father." He said, "Well, can I pray for you?" "I was so tired. We had been through so much, my sons and I." And this kind of person just came at me and just say, "Can I pray with you?" Now, that is very, very powerful, and I mean, it'll be interesting. Like I said, the trial is going on today. They might take the I'm thinking that that the trial was not today because it's Good Friday with Easter being on Sunday. But anyway, it'll be interesting to see what comes up in the coming weeks. I think I had read somewhere that this might take 4 weeks for the trial. But let me know in the comments below what you think about the Derek Chauvin trial. Have you watched any of it? What is your immediate take on it? And I'll see you in the next video. And that's going to do it for the news for this week. I am Bulow. Again, if you like what you watched, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Also subscribe and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell an enemy or two even. And I will be back next week. Until next time, peace.